If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Today I'm going to talk about the balance between flexibility and control. And there's a specific part of the organization that we need to consider as we concern ourselves with this balance between flexibility and control. I'll talk about what that is. This podcast is for largely for bosses and managers, for people who are involved in designing workflow. As an individual, it's probably going to be useful as you understand this sort of thing and you begin to look for ways to help your organization move in these directions. And we'll talk a little bit about the benefit of doing that for the folks in the organization. So I think this will be a useful podcast for you in terms of thinking it through and some support for doing some things that may seem like they're not exactly what the world is telling you to do. So we'll work through all that in this podcast. As organization designers, as the owners of the business process, we all try to help our organizations be flexible. And we hear about the benefits of flexibility and responsiveness and flat organizational structure. We hear about all this. And our people push for this kind of autonomy for reasons that we'll get into later. In addition, we hear about teams, and so we try to design our organizations in particular ways. We feel that fast communication is good, fast information exchange. All of our people will always say they need more information, and that may or may not be true. But all this piles up together, and we have this tendency to feel that structure, procedure, management is slow and inflexible. And we think that those procedures limit our organizational speed and our organizational responsiveness. And as I said, we know that our employees want autonomy, and there are good arguments to give people autonomy. And so this is a nuanced point here. This is not a clear-cut area of, sure, do it that way. So we'll talk about what some of those trade-offs might be. And for example, in our individual management systems, we try to make things predictable. As participants in this organization, as individual humans, we try to make things predictable because constant flexibility forces task switching, and that induces stress. So we, as individuals, tend to want to implement our own structures for developing consistency and developing predictability. A big part of what is happening is our people are fighting to control something that our organizational systems may be creating or amplifying. So we're gaining these possible benefits of flexibility, but really beginning to put those costs on the backs of our people. And this lowers their productivity, increases their stress, and it leads to overwork, low engagement, and burnout for our people. And we claim that our people are our greatest asset, but we may not be using them according to the owner's manual, so to speak. So the question is, can we, as bosses, as people who design these systems and enforce use of these systems, can we do better? And I think we have to try. And so we'll walk through some of these trade-offs and begin to think about what we need to do to help our people best cope with the world as it is. So I focus a lot on the individual problem and the tool set to manage that elsewhere. I spend a lot of time helping individual contributors build systems that support their productivity in sound ways and supporting their productivity while lowering their stress. If you're looking for an individual solution, then there's plenty of opportunity for that. But on this one, we're going to focus on the organization and how the organization works. But we do want to talk about stress because it's an important problem. People experience stress really because they feel like they don't exert control. So unpredictability produces stress. We're often called to respond and react, and we feel urgency to do that. And so we don't have the opportunity to think through solutions very well. And all of this produces stress. And in organizations, the problems is particularly acute because there's lots of people that have expectations of us, and we try to meet all of those expectations. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into teaming, and we'll reinforce that point. Why am I talking to bosses here? Bosses need to exert some control. The boss owns the business model. And there's really two components to that. Part of the business model is that there's a valuable product that gets produced. And the other part is that there is some process by which this valuable product is produced. And that's really what it means to have an organization. So the boss says, hey, we're going to make this thing, and the market values it. And then the boss says, and we make it in these ways such that we can control cost and earn a profit and pay everybody's salary. And all of that business model is owned by the boss. Now, I say boss, it might be the CEO, it might be the president, but it might also be division leads, team leads, even, who are naturally in charge of this workflow, we'll say, the business processes that produce these outcomes. And broken business models are really a cause of problems in the organization. I'm not sure that we think of it in those terms all the time, but that's a way to think about it, is this business model, particularly, well, if either the first part or the second part is not working the way we expected, then we're going to have problems with our business. But all that's in the hands of the organizational leader, the owner of the business model, and that may be at various levels of the organization. My experience with this is we had a big project that we were working on. It was an IT project that we were working on. And the way this organization formed is we got a grant to build the organization that was going to build this software solution. And it started out with just the executive team, and the executive team said, okay, we need a managerial layer so that we can hire all the people that we need to put this organization together so we can build this software. And all of that business model was in the hands of the leadership. And so we hired managers and we said, okay, what do you need in order to fulfill this set of requirements? And we talked about that for a long time. And then the manager said, well, we need this kind of structure in our organization. We need these people. Here's how many we think we need. And eventually what wound up happening is that the people that we hired at the individual contributor level, I'm not talking about the managerial layer here, but the individual contributor level, and there were 100 of them, maybe a little more at one point, they started complaining about feeling like they were overworked. And fair enough. I mean, that's a pretty common employee complaint, but we looked into it and we agreed that they were working too hard. And so we went to the management layer and we said, okay, we designed this process. We built this organization and we built it the way we thought it would work best. And if we made estimates that were wrong or we built a process that's wrong, then we need to own that and fix it and not just require our people to overcome the challenges of that. In other words, if we built a bad business model, then we need to fix the business model and not push that responsibility over onto our people. And so from that perspective, it's the business leader's responsibility to fix it. They're the only ones really that can. Now, in this fixing, you do want to include the organization and you want to include the people. But that doesn't make it their responsibility to fix it. It's still our responsibility to fix it. And so when we talk about this business process that produces this valuable product, that's where this structure comes in that we want to think about. Now, when we think about structure and process in organization, there are challenges to developing that structure. There are challenges to the idea of structure. And so I want to address those really quickly. One thing is we're told that the people that work for us need autonomy. And I believe that's true. And the people that work for us seek autonomy. It's part of human nature that people don't like to be told what to do. And so in order to gain the privilege to tell them what to do, we pay the money. Is one, I guess, not terribly cynical, but one view of what's going on in the organization. And so we feel this pressure to give autonomy. And we know that both from the managerial perspective, in that knowledge workers do need to have autonomy. And people want autonomy. And so there are these forces then that push us in the direction of autonomy. We're taught to use teams in our organization, that teams are more productive than individuals, that a team can be more powerful than just a collection of individuals. And we talk about this and we talk about this. And a lot of that conversation is about, well, and teams need to be autonomous. Okay, yes, they probably do. Autonomy is a good thing. And all of these forces together cause challenges. So teams are a challenge to do well. Being a member of a team and helping that team be a good team is a challenge. And also this notion of autonomy, and we sacrifice structure for that autonomy, and that lack of lack of structure then causes challenges that are longer term in nature. And so as bosses, we need to be careful about how all this happens. In particular, where we need to be careful is the work assignment challenge. And I think that many of our organizations, we don't have visibility into how work gets assigned. And I say that because in most organizations, just about anybody in the organization can pick up the phone and call just about anybody else in the organization and say, hey, we need help with XYZ. And that is a work assignment, because the person receiving the call wants to be a good member of the organization, a good team player. So they tend to say yes. But without recognizing that it really is a work assignment and that these trade-offs have to be balanced. So in organizations, we tend to, the term is multi-teaming. So we tend to have these very valuable people working for us, these very expensive resources. And we say, okay, well, you're a part member of this team, that team, and the other team. So allocate your time across those teams. And this is a huge structural managerial challenge for the individual in question. And in addition to having multiple sets of responsibilities, they've got multiple teams to deal with and multiple contexts. And when you're talking about dealing with different teams and dealing with different individuals, those context switches are a huge challenge. So all of these things together, autonomy, teaming, work assignment, lack of structure around work assignment, all these things together are attempts at autonomy, which is a good thing, but may be overlooking the dangers of doing that. So one is our organizational structure and our tendency to want to structure our organizations according to these general rules. Fair enough? Okay. The other challenge to structure is our communication tools tend to disrupt structure. And that's a little bit of a complex thought, so I'll break it down. Modern communication tools in the organization almost all focus on asynchronous communication. And that's a challenge, and we'll get into that. Because of the speed of communication, we can assign work quickly. And this has been demonstrated in several experiments that small barriers to communication will inhibit one person's tendency to try to get other people involved in what they're doing. The bottom line is they'll do their own work instead of trying to find somebody to give their work to. And it's the ease of communication is one factor in doing that. And with these communication tools that we have, these unstructured communication tools, it's easy to do that. And we as the organization owners, as the business model owners, really allow this to happen and may not be noticing that it does happen. We may be blind to that. We may not have visibility into that part of the process. So we get people in the organization structure is the way it is, and the organization's tools are what they are. And then we say, okay, we'll go and be productive, and we give people autonomy. And the structures that we put in place really tend to inhibit structure. And structure is good for people. So that's kind of where we're at. And our tools amplify that disruption of structure, particularly our communication tools. And particularly, I'll say the asynchronous communication tools. So I'll get into this a little bit more when we talk about how this pushes our people into challenging work and workflows. So we design an organization and we design it according to these rules of thumb. And then we say, okay, people go work in this, and then they have this stress and overwork and burnout. And we want to help them address that because we know that's bad. Right? If your business model requires everybody you hire to be superhuman, then you may want to reconsider your business model. McDonald's is a great example of a wonderful 20th century company. And they built their entire organization, huge, profitable organization, recognizing that they didn't have to hire superhuman people. They just had to hire people and give them structure. And that meant they could run their organization with a bunch of basically high school kids. And there's a lot to be said for that. And we get out into the modern workplace and we go, oh, structure is bad because people need autonomy. Well, people still need structure. And so this is all about how we balance those things. So our organizational structures tend to push people into these challenges of autonomy. And at the same time, it seems that many organizations don't help people with those challenges of autonomy. We tend to think that, hey, autonomy is good, they can handle it. And in many cases, maybe that's not quite as true as we think it is. So we got to face those challenges and face them with our organizational structure, our business model, our communications standards, these different kinds of things. So When we look at these challenging workflows, so the first thing I'll say is we don't tend to train people in communication. We sort of think people are probably already good at communication, and it's a little bit of an icky thing to talk about if we want to change the way somebody communicates. And people say, oh, autonomy, I need to work the way I need to work. And so we're faced with this cultural challenge of developing standards in these areas. It's almost like, it's almost like we're talking to somebody in our organization about a personal subject, but personal hygiene or something icky like that. And I'm sorry, I don't have a better word than icky. But the tendency is, well, that's too personal. That's too idiosyncratic to the individual for us to try to mess with and enforce standards. And I get it. That's kind of a natural response. And so we as organization leaders kind of throw our hands up and go, okay, well, you need to communicate and you really don't want to hear from me training in communication, right? And and then this sort of just goes along. And in those structures that, well, I'll say in that lack of structure, our people tend to do what's most convenient for them. They don't necessarily do what's best for them. They do what's most convenient. And as I was developing this podcast, I'm developing the script for another podcast where I talk about the fact that convenience and efficiency and effectiveness are all different things, right? Convenience is not necessarily the be all and end all of productivity. And so that's going to be a challenging statement. So I hope you'll tune in for that podcast sometime in the next, 3 or 4 episodes. So as an example, when we talk about communication, so I don't necessarily want to distinguish between face-to-face communication and not face-to-face communication. But what I want to do is distinguish between synchronous communication and asynchronous communication. So synchronous communication is a natural outgrowth of a face-to-face conversation. And asynchronous communication is a natural feature of things like email. So we send an email and we say, well, they'll get to it when they can. Where if we need more urgency, then we tend to go towards synchronous communication. And there's a little bit of a blurry line there. And I've defined synchronous versus asynchronous communication in other podcasts. But the deal with synchronous and asynchronous is synchronous is much more challenging to set up. Asynchronous is much more convenient. But asynchronous is much harder to execute. Asynchronous communication is really hard to do well. And I go into great detail elsewhere, but asynchronous, you have to assume that people understand the words that you're using and saying versus synchronous communication where we can constantly check for understanding. And so this is a huge challenge. Our speech patterns, our communication style have not yet changed and grown to the point where we're really good at asynchronous communication. And we've been trying for a while now. Asynchronous communication is things like letters, one-way kind of communication. And it's really hard to do well. And Cal Newport talks about this in his book, A World Without Email. And there's various places where we've talked about it. But asynchronous communication is really challenging to pull off. But it's convenient. And so people default to it and flow to it. People look at scheduling a meeting versus sending an email and they go, well, scheduling a meeting's hard. So I'm just going to flash out an email. Well, Scheduling a meeting is hard, but holding a meeting is actually pretty straightforward. The communication in face-to-face is pretty straightforward. It's much easier versus the communication in asynchronous, where we're constantly seeking clarification from each other. And thus, the old adage that a 5-minute conversation can take 20 emails. And so the question is, do we, in our organizational structure, do we favor synchronous communication? And do we enforce that structure with our people? Or do we go, you can communicate, it's on you, deal with it. And then they, because of the convenience factor, they tend to default to asynchronous communication, whether they do it well or not. So another challenge is this notion, another challenge to our communication is this teaming structure. So teams are hard to do well. We hear in sports, we hear about this notion of team chemistry. And a high functioning team can take a long time to reach that point. There's lots of study of team structure and teaming in the Scrum methodology and agile programming and such like. And so this has been studied. And just to give you an example of the challenge of a team. So Fred Brooks in the Mythical Man Month brought this out as sort of a mathematical treatment. And here's what happens. So let's say you have a team you're on, and including yourself, there's 10 people on the team. And we think, okay, well, we need to be faster. There's more work than we thought. So let's add somebody to the team. So let's bring an 11th person into this team. And if we stop to think about that from a communication standpoint, is this a huge challenge to communication? Then we do simple math and we go, well, yes, we're adding 10% more staff to the team, so to speak. And so, 10% more communication. Well, according to Fred Brooks, that's not the way it works, because in a 10-person team, there are 55 dyad communication pairs. So if everybody counts up the number of people they communicate with, then the whole team constitutes 55 communication paths. And then we add an 11th person. Well, we've just added 10 communication paths. So we've increased our communication load by 20%, not 10%. And so you can argue with Brooks's model, and that's fine, but we don't tend to think in these ways. And so this is one of the many reasons why teaming is challenging. The Scrum people will say, anytime you change the structure of a team at all, particularly personnel on the team, then you have to back up and let the team reform. And that can take a long time for them to get back to some level of productivity that they had before as they figure out how they're going to communicate as a team. And that's just an example of this challenge of teaming. And we hear, oh, you need teams. Teams are good. Teams are diverse. Teams get better results, et cetera, et cetera. Well, yes, but teams also have overhead. And the bigger the team is, the more overhead. So back to kind of organizational design. So we need to keep all this stuff in mind as we assess the business model, as we assess the organization. We need to be thoughtful about that design. And I would say we tend to downplay the teaming challenge. We tend to downplay the asynchronous communication challenge. And that really, I think, it's easy to say, well, people can just deal with it. But if we're responsible for the business model, then we need to build a business model in which people can be successful and not be confronted with this extremely challenging communication model in this extremely challenging team environment. One of the things that you hear in Scrum is if you've got a well-functioning team, you need to protect and defend that team. And they talk about this from the standpoint of the phrase is bringing work to the team. And what they're claiming is that we tend to reorganize the team to suit the work. So we've got a team together and they finish a project. And then we've got another project coming down the pike, and our tendency is to restructure a new team to face this new challenge. And in the Scrum world, they talk about this notion of, well, team formation is really hard. And so it may be better to have a team, an existing team, face a challenge that's going to stretch them in some ways than it is to tear apart that team and reconstitute another team. And so, this is another view on the challenge of good teams, but we don't think about these things as we apply the rules of thumb of good management. So we really have to be introspective as organizational designers, as business model owners, about whether or not our business model is helping or hurting, right? So, these factors are there, and our people, if we don't deal with them and create structure, then our people tend to deal with them. And for various reasons, as we said, people tend to look for convenience more quickly. They move towards convenience more than, structure and thoughtful execution. So we've talked about these factors that push our people in directions that we may really not need for them to go. So my basic argument is that organizational design, business model structure, communication standards can increase or decrease stress on individuals. So to recap the argument today, people like structure and need structure. We need variety, but if it's constantly not knowing where we're at and constantly not knowing what we need to do and having to figure that out on the fly, that's an immense challenge to people. And if we're going to have an effective organization, then we need to help people address that challenge, and we need to give them some structure about what they can expect and what we ask for them to do. And there are forces that fight against our tendency to structure. And a lot of the forces that fight against that are human nature. People reflexively reject structure. And people say, well, I need freedom. And that's fine, but that's a challenge. And then, some of the rules of thumb that we have, like teams are better than individuals, also can increase this load on our people without us really being aware of it. So, how does organization design increase and decrease stress on individuals? Well, the first is our communication standards and our communications design. And I would say many of us, as owners of business models, don't design communications. And this is some recap from before, we just don't engage at that level. For various reasons, and we don't teach people standards for communication, and we don't enforce standards for communication. One way to organize this thinking is to really address autonomy itself for our people. We need to think about autonomy doesn't necessarily have to be an all or nothing shot. We tend to hear that people need autonomy, and we go, well, okay, let's paint that with a broad brush. They need autonomy. They need to be able to decide everything about their work and their engagement with the organization. And I would say that that's really kind of an overreach on the part of the autonomy thinkers. I think when we talk about knowledge workers and their need for autonomy, and this goes back to Peter Drucker, who said, you got to give knowledge workers autonomy because they're the experts. They know what they need to do. And I certainly agree with that. And I've used example after example. We don't go into the doctor's office and tell the doctor how to do his or her job because they're the experts and we're not. And if we start trying to tell them how to do their job, then in many ways, we're literally making them worse at what they do. An example is if you go to the doctor and he says, hey, you need an MRI in order for us to diagnose this. And you go, no, I'm not getting in the MRI machine. You'll just have to deal with my blood pressure reading. And then the doctor goes, well, I can't diagnose what you're asking me to diagnose based on understanding what your blood pressure is. So we're actually, and we would never do this in the doctor's office. And so we take that and we go, okay, well, our people need to work this way as well. Well, maybe, particularly when it comes to the detail of how they're going to execute their own work. And they're experts in their process and they build things the way they build things. They do their job the way they do their job because they've learned how to do that. They understand the tools better than we do because they're experts. And then but there's another piece of this whole autonomy business, which is how do we decide what work they should be doing and within broad parameters when they should be doing it. So this is more of a work assignment piece. I think that knowledge workers very much need task autonomy in the sense that we say, hey, I need the profit and loss statement for last year. And we don't say, okay, well, here's how you build a profit and loss statement because they should know best. And then when they deliver the profit and loss statement, they're teaching us how to use the profit and loss statement in some ways. But that doesn't mean that we can leave them alone to decide when we're going to need a profit and loss statement. We can get to a level of autonomy where all we really have is chaos. And when we think about work assignment, that's the area that I think we need to exert more control over. And we need to be very careful about granting our people the ability to assign work to each other. And I'm not going to go so far as to claim that anybody's lazy, but I am going to say that there is a human tendency to, when we're confronted with work, to try to get other people to help us with that work. And whether it's, quote, our work or not, we often do tend to think, okay, well, I need X, Y, and Z person to come and do their part for this. And if it's very, very easy to communicate that work assignment, then we tend to move towards convenience in our spectrum. And we tend to ask for this kind of help. And what we're actually doing without really noticing it is we're assigning work to each other. And that can really move the whole organization spiraling out of control. And we say autonomy and teams, and those are good things. So we say we need to leave our people alone and let them do what they do. And yes, in a sense, we do need to do that, but we also need to help them. And the way we help them, the area in which we need to help them is to structure this whole notion of work assignment. So yes, you have autonomy to do what it is you need to do. But when it comes to the organization having the autonomy to assign work to other people, that's probably where we need to step in and intervene. And if we're going to intervene in these areas, then where we need to do that is at the level of communication and at the level of teams. And we need to say, okay, well, these are the mechanisms by which work naturally gets assigned in organizations. Our mechanisms are our communication mechanisms and our teaming structures. And so people can assign work to each other. A team, for example, there's this notion of team creep. So if you've got a team working on a project and the team is getting to a point in their project where they bump up against something, does the team actually have the authority to pull in other people and assign work to other people outside of the team? Or is that team boundary pretty structured, team boundary in terms of work assignment? Or is that team boundary pretty structured and we challenge their right to bring other people onto the team and assign them work? And so this then goes back to organizational design and communication standards. I've been on many teams where the team gets together and they go, oh, we didn't know we were going to face challenge X, Y, and Z. Let's just call up, somebody in accounting and get them to help us walk through this problem. Well, we're deciding to grow the size of our team as a convenience in some ways versus as a structured decision of resource allocation. And it's so easy to do with modern communication. It's not hard to pull up your email if you're in an organization and find some random person in accounting and say, hey, can you help me with this? And it's so easy, in fact, that becomes our default without really considering whether that person has any responsibility to help us do what it is we're trying to do. And so organizational structure and communication structure can be managed such that they support good work assignment practices versus some chaotic ability for, lower level team members to assign each other work. Maybe another perspective on this is helpful. I was with a company and I was a mid-level manager with this company, and I had zero spending authority, none. I could not cause the organization to spend money. The financial controls were very, very tight. But I could and routinely did call meetings that cost that organization, thousands of dollars per hour, and created challenges in workflow for the other people that I needed to have in the meeting. And it was simple. And so I did it, right? It was convenient and easy for me to convene a meeting versus the organizational structures in place made it very difficult for me to spend money. And so the organizational design then and the organizational structure and communication structure need to be tuned up such that they support my, I'm going to say, good behavior rather than allowing my tendency towards convenience and tendency towards not thinking it through as I'm doing these things. So that's kind of the way to think about it, but that may not resonate with you as much as it did with me. So let's begin to summarize and wrap this up. So we talked about organizational design can increase stress on individuals, but a good organizational design can decrease stress on individuals. And by stress, I mean this whole business of work assignment, deadlines, all of these communication challenges, all of these different ideas. So we think about designing communications, and we understand that asynchronous communication is very convenient, but very difficult. Synchronous is inconvenient, but almost all of us are better skilled at synchronous communication than non-synchronous communication. Synchronous communication versus asynchronous communication. And we've all struggled with writing the right kind of email, and that's an example of this challenge of asynchronous communication. But because of the convenience factor, we tend to default to asynchronous communication tools. So, can we and should we design the organization such that the use of asynchronous communication is reduced? And we help people handle that challenge. And we lean more towards synchronous communication, even though it's less convenient. So communications design, and it's perfectly fair in my mind for the business model, for the organizational leader, and their responsibility is to produce a product effectively, efficiently. Is it within their rights, I'll say, to design communication and to have communication processes and standards and to enforce those communication processes and standards? And I would say yes, particularly because that's the way work gets assigned. And so, as the organizational designer, as the organizational leader, I would argue that we have every right within our team, within our organization, to say, this is how we communicate, this is how we assign work to each other. And for us to have policy and structure in place. Now, I hear, hey, that's just going to slow us down. Well, that's the convenience versus efficiency argument. And things that slow us down a little bit in the short term are not necessarily bad for our effectiveness. Now, that's a strange way to say it, and it's a strange way to understand it. But effectiveness is much bigger than momentary convenience. And I'll do a whole podcast to develop this idea. So I think we have the responsibility as owners of this business model, as designers of the organization. I think we have this responsibility to put structure in place around communications, because that communications is how work gets assigned, sort of in the dark, if you will, without high visibility. I would say the other thing that we need to consider is team structure. And is our team structure, are we doing it for the sake of convenience, or are we doing it for the sake of effectiveness? And how do teams operate? Do we allow teams greater autonomy than we allow individuals? What is the level of autonomy for a team? I think a team is structured in part so that we can control the work assignment boundary. And we can easily think in terms of, okay, well, within the team, we self-assign work. In other words, the team gets together and the team decides who's going to do what parts of the project. And we give the team that level of authority. And that's as good a definition of team as you're likely to come across. So a team is a group of people who are expected to be able to assign each other work and expected to have that level of autonomy within the structure of the team. But that does not necessarily mean that the team has that level of authority outside of that team boundary. And so thinking about that design and thinking about the policy and standards and structure that we put in place to help the team recognize and self-enforce that boundary on their work. So team structure is that autonomy challenge is also there for teams. And team structure raises the stakes on good communications. It in some ways makes it harder, right? So a team, as it's constituting itself in order to be effective, they have to learn to communicate with each other at a different level. They have to build that chemistry. And once it's built, it's easy to disrupt and very hard to rebuild. And so in our organizational structure and policy, how do we treat teams? And are we using them in the best ways? And when we look at these two things, they collide in this notion of multi-teaming. So we have an individual in our organization who's a highly paid resource, but they don't need to be 100% committed to a specific project. So we say, hey, give this team 25% of your time, and then the rest of your time do something else. And do we have visibility into how that works? So even if we don't allow teams to reach out to these experts and make claims on their time, do we ourselves have visibility, and are we managing that multi-teaming assignment? Because left to their own devices, maybe a decent phrase is team creep. So you've got a team and you've got 5 people that are 100% dedicated to working on this team, and can they reach out and within their own authority and autonomy, can they grow the team incrementally? And so team creep, right? I would suggest, and I don't know of any studies on this, I would suggest that in certain situations, in certain organizations, team size tends to grow. And we start a project with 5 people on it, and then after 6 months, the project is underway, and hopefully it's got the 5 original people, and we're not messing with that team. But also they've got, a tenth of that person's time and a quarter of this other person's time, and right. And before long, they've got 2 or 3 additional FTE, full-time equivalent, resources that have been, what would we say, grafted into the team. And do we have structure? As we say, okay, teams, you have autonomy. Do we have structure to help them recognize that autonomy? Another way that teams can creep is they look outside the team and they go, oh, well, the secretary doesn't look too busy. Let's go get the secretary to do some admin for us. And well, they don't have visibility into how busy the secretary is. So this is where this team creep idea comes from. So to wrap it up and to pull out some of the bigger ideas that I think we need to think about as organizational designers, we need to not believe that flexibility and autonomy are free. Flexibility is very difficult to achieve, and autonomy is easy to assign and hard to manage. So we've got to think through that. What kinds of autonomy? Let's don't paint with a broad brush here, but let's have a little more nuance about what we're talking about. And that requires an understanding and a structure of autonomy. And we need to stop maybe thinking of autonomy as this completely free will thing and say, okay, well, we've got bounded autonomy. Okay. Within this structure, you can do whatever you want. But if you get outside of this, then we have a process for that. Develop and think through work assignment procedures. And don't automatically believe that that's something you can leave alone, right? That may not be within the definition of autonomy in the organization that you've designed. Another idea is, particularly for teams and for key resources, we need to make work visible. How we go about that is another complete podcast, because status reporting has a real bad name. And I think it has a bad name, not because it's a bad thing, but because we do it poorly. So how are we going to make work visible within our organization? And how are we going to be clear on, for example, this key resource? And how are we going to understand that they're spending 5 or 7% of their time supporting some team somewhere in a way that's not visible to us, but in a way that uses up that resource? And then you'll want to take a close review of your organization's communication structure, and particularly from the standpoint of synchronous versus asynchronous communication, and this notion of convenience versus effectiveness. And we need to help people not automatically fall back on their own convenience, both individual people and teams not fall back on their own convenience, and have this ability to make work assignments outside of the boundary of their autonomy. This has been a big thought piece, and I've tried to summarize it with these ideas. So think carefully about flexibility and autonomy, and it's a nuanced thing. It's perfectly acceptable for you to develop work assignment procedures, and that does not, in my opinion, interfere with knowledge worker autonomy as it's intended. We need to make work visible. We need to help people understand what all they're involved in and measure that for them. And then we really need to look carefully at our organization's communication structure, and particularly for unintended consequences of this reliance on convenience. So this is an opportunity to take a look at your organizational structure. It's a lot of hard work, but it will pay back in huge benefits over time as we make our organization, our company, our team more effective and thus more productive. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.